of the legal issues that clients were wanting advice on post-Francis, I think the main question was first how they were to assess themselves against the recommendations first by Francis, and given the number of recommendations and the length of the report, how to make sense of what practical steps they needed to take. Now that the government's initial response has been published, I think it's clearer about the themes that organisations should follow or should look at when tackling the issues for their own organisation. So we have prevention, detection, prompt action, robust accountability, and also the staffing issues. And I think that gives a focus to how organisations respond on the legal issues raised. And the second key area that's been of concern has been patient safety, quite obviously. And there's a recognition that this might be the best time on re-looking at their own organisations to identify where there may be dysfunctional teams, that there might be long-standing issues in tackling those problems, and recognising that Francis may have created an environment where it's easier for workforce to welcome changes in tackling those teams. Another key area has been the question of the duty of candour and exactly what that's going to mean. And that has already been introduced in the standard contract with quite significant penalties. But I think organisations are concerned about whether they are complying properly. Most will say that they are trying to provide the right level of information and be open, but there's a concern about how that might impact on claims against them. Yeah, I think that must be right, because partly what Francis recognised as organisational failings, organisations focusing on some targets but not getting the big picture. But there's also a key area there that is quite individual in the recommendations. What is it that went wrong with the culture and also with the way individuals themselves responded that needs to be tackled? And does that mean that there are cultural issues widely that need to be addressed, and that there is an opportunity to look at cultural issues and see if changes can be made? Looking at the issues that chief execs are asking about, and also those that we would say chief execs need to think about, clearly there is the way in which each organisation looks at the themes of the recommendations and looks to their own heart of their organisation to see what they need to change if things do need to change. Clearly there's also been great focus on the duty of candour and transparency of information. And I think the key question is, how do you reassure staff that they can come forward with concerns, and that if they do, that won't create a witch hunt where there's a culture of fear? And usefully, this was a point that was picked up in the government's response, particularly on the point about whether the duty of candour should become something that attracted criminal sanctions. And the government said it's going to consider further what implications that might have, but is very anxious not to create a culture of fear. I think the other point that is relevant is that, given the level of information that's required and the different types of information that chief execs are required to report against, is the information that they are giving adequate and also accurate to the different agencies? So here we have a question about the standard and also consistency of information given the new contractual penalties particularly. I think the question about the point that we are now and how we've arrived at that point is a complex one. Clearly we wouldn't have needed such a long inquiry and or such a long report with so many recommendations if the issues were at all simple. There do seem to be two strands to it: the wider organisation, the wider system, and at a cultural level too. One of the main points that seems to have been made well in both the report and also in the government's response is this question about, did we hit the target but miss the point? And I think that is very relevant to how the issues in mid-staffs arose. it was simply a matter of indicator or report after report seeming to hit the wrong place, or not, for no system to have picked up any of the failings. But apart from the system issues, I think that you can't read the report or listen to the testimony of those involved without being very moved and think that it must, in fact, go beyond simply a system and reporting's issue. I mean, at the heart of it, I think we have questions about how staff on wards allowed basic standards to slip. I mean, can this be excused? Is it too easy to say there was just a focus on financial issues? Or is it likely that there are some staff who may be held personally to account? The question about what challenges are going to arise legally following Francis is an interesting one, and I think will partly depend on the response and also legislation brought in, because that in itself may change the manner of legal claims. Now, we think that it's likely that certainly there will be challenge around the duty of candour, with patients more conscious of their rights and of a concern that the information that they're getting about their services is accurate. So a greater request or challenge for information and for that to be accurate. And that links in, of course, to the new contractual duty of candour and the ability of commissioners to levy fairly significant fines for a failure to act in a candid manner. We also think that there's likely to be some police interest in the hospital deaths. And we think that historically, whilst historically there has been a very low level of claims against hospital directors and against trusts, particularly on corporate manslaughter charges, it may be that with this focus there is increased drive to find evidence of organisational culpability, i.e. corporate manslaughter charges. In terms of legislation changes, it's interesting that with the timing of Francis, we have shortly afterwards the Health and Social Care Act, the large part of it coming into force. And in fact, much of what is recommended in Francis has already been implemented to some degree or another, either through legislation or through guidance. In terms of what we think is likely to change, we do think that some legislation and new legislation is likely to be necessary, but possibly not in this parliamentary term. And this is because we'd expect the government to wait for the outcome, particularly on the complaint system, but also quality by Don Berwick, and we'd expect further comment from the government following those issues. In terms of other changes, there may need to be some changes to the CQC's role. That might be done relatively simply, though, with a delegation rather than statutory changes. In terms of key issues that particularly hospitals and NHS providers are looking at, one common theme is how they work with other organisations. In the past there's been a focus on mergers, acquisitions, but also joint venturing and partnering with other organisations in order to reduce overhead. The question arising is whether that gives rise to competition law issues, and the particular focus that has now is because the OFT reviews mergers between NHS providers and is taking a keen interest in the sector, particularly the benefits that hospital mergers will bring. There seems to be a degree of uncertainty about bedding in new relationships and also the approach that new commissioners will take to contracts. Some organisations concerned about whether they will be able to retain services or be successful if services are tendered, and the impact that might have on how they plan not only their 5% savings, but also how they make the longer strategic changes for their organisation.